Imagine finding a strange bowl of fruit that had been sitting in the sun for several days. The fruit smells different. It's softer, juicier, and something about it has changed. You taste it, and suddenly you notice something unusual. Your body feels different. Your mind feels lighter. Your surroundings seem slightly different. Thousands of years ago, long before chemistry, laboratories, or written science, humans may have encountered something remarkably similar. There were no breweries, no wineries, no bottles, no recipes explaining fermentation. Yet somehow, humans discovered alcohol. But here's the fascinating question. How? Did someone deliberately invent it? Did they watch animals eating fermented fruit? Or did nature simply make alcohol first, and humans learned how to reproduce it? Let's travel back through thousands of years of human history and uncover how one of humanity's strangest discoveries may have happened. Alcohol was probably older than civilization. The first important thing to understand is this. Humans probably didn't invent fermentation. Nature did. When fruits become very ripe, their natural sugars can be converted into alcohol by microorganisms called yeast. Yeast is found naturally on fruits and in the environment. Under the right conditions, yeast consumes sugar and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Humans didn't understand any of this. They didn't know what yeast was. They didn't know what fermentation meant. They simply encountered the results: a fallen fruit, a warm environment, a little time, and suddenly, the fruit had changed. This could have happened naturally around humans for millions of years. So the first alcoholic drink may not have been created in a laboratory, or even inside a human settlement. It may have been discovered on the ground. Did animals discover it first? Here's where things become even more interesting. Wild animals sometimes eat extremely ripe or fermented fruits. Birds, monkeys, elephants, and other fruit-eating animals have all been observed consuming fermented or alcohol-containing foods. Of course, this doesn't prove that ancient humans learned about alcohol by watching animals, but it's an intriguing possibility. Imagine an early human observing animals gathering around unusually ripe fruit. Maybe they noticed the smell. Maybe they noticed that certain fruits were different. Humans were incredibly observant. They watched animals to discover which plants were safe, which berries were poisonous, where water could be found, and which foods were worth collecting. So fermented fruit may have become another natural curiosity, something strange, but potentially edible. The first accidental fermentation. Now imagine a prehistoric group collecting fruit. They bring it back to camp. Some of it gets eaten immediately, but some is placed inside a hollow container. Maybe a wooden vessel, maybe an animal skin container, maybe later a clay pot. The fruit sits there. Hours become days. The sugars inside begin interacting with naturally occurring yeast. Fermentation starts. The fruit becomes softer. Its smell changes. Bubbles may appear. And eventually, alcohol forms. The people who tasted it may have discovered something completely new, not because they understood the science, but because they experimented. This is one of the most important things about human history. Our ancestors constantly interacted with their environment. They tried things, they remembered what happened, and they repeated successful discoveries. Humans learned to control fermentation. Eventually, accidental discoveries could become deliberate techniques. Instead of waiting for fruit to ferment randomly, people could begin repeating the process. This was a huge step. They learned that certain ingredients work better. They learned that warmth affected the process. They discovered that containers could preserve liquids. And eventually, humans began producing alcoholic drinks intentionally. This is where alcohol stopped being simply something nature occasionally created, and became something humans could make. The exact moment this happened is impossible to identify. There wasn't one person who suddenly announced, "Today, I have invented alcohol." Instead, it was probably thousands of tiny discoveries made by countless people across generations. What was the first alcoholic drink? We don't know for certain. Different alcoholic drinks could have appeared independently in different places. Fermented fruit could produce primitive wine-like beverages. Grains could eventually be transformed into beer. Honey could ferment into mead. Different plants and ingredients could create different drinks. But one of the oldest strong archaeological clues for intentional alcohol production comes from ancient pottery. Researchers have found evidence suggesting that people were producing fermented beverages thousands of years ago. One famous example comes from Rockefet Cave in present-day Israel, where evidence suggests Natufian people may have brewed a grain-based fermented drink around 13,000 years ago. That is astonishing. It means beer-like brewing may predate agriculture. Think about that. Humans may have been experimenting with fermented grain beverages before large-scale farming transformed human society. Beer may have been older than you think. When most people imagine ancient beer, they picture Egyptians or Mesopotamians, and those civilizations absolutely developed sophisticated brewing traditions. But beer itself may be much older. As humans began collecting wild grains, they discovered that grains could be processed into food. Eventually, people learned to soak and germinate grains. This creates malt. When crushed malt is mixed with water, its sugars become available. Yeast can then ferment those sugars into alcohol. But early beer probably didn't look or taste like modern beer. It may have been thick, cloudy, full of grain particles, and completely different from the drinks we know today. Yet the basic principle was already there. Grain plus water plus yeast plus time equals fermentation. Agriculture changed everything. Then something enormous happened. Humans began farming. Instead of constantly moving in search of wild food, many communities started growing crops: wheat, barley, grapes, and other plants. This created reliable supplies of ingredients that could be fermented. Once people had surplus grain and fruit, they had something they could store and experiment with. Alcohol production could now become part of settled life. Villages grew, food production increased, and fermentation became easier to control. This doesn't mean humans invented agriculture to make alcohol. That's an oversimplification. But alcohol certainly became increasingly important once people began producing crops in large quantities. Ancient beer wasn't just a drink. In ancient societies, beer could be much more than something people consume for pleasure. It could provide calories. It could be used in social gatherings. It could appear in religious ceremonies. And it could become part of everyday life. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer became deeply connected with society. People brewed different types of beer. Workers could receive beer as part of their rations, and written records eventually documented beer production and distribution. This tells us something important. Alcohol had transformed from a strange natural phenomenon into an organized part of civilization. The world's first brewers, early brewers, didn't have stainless steel tanks. They didn't have thermometers. They didn't have microscopes. They couldn't measure alcohol percentage. They didn't even know yeast existed. But they had something incredibly valuable: experience. They learned through repetition. This batch worked. That batch didn't. This grain produced a better drink. That container spoiled the mixture. This temperature helped. That one didn't. Over generations, these observations became brewing knowledge. The brewer became an experimenter, not a scientist in the modern sense, but someone learning through observation. And this pattern appears again and again throughout human history. Wine followed its own story. While beer developed around grains, fermented fruit created another ancient tradition: wine. Grapes naturally contain high levels of sugar. That makes them particularly suitable for fermentation. Wild grapes could begin fermenting naturally when crushed. Humans eventually learned to deliberately collect grapes, crush them, and preserve the resulting liquid. Archaeological evidence suggests intentional winemaking existed thousands of years ago. One of the oldest known examples comes from the region of modern-day Georgia, where researchers have found evidence associated with ancient grape wine production dating back roughly 8,000 years. Imagine that. Thousands of years before modern vineyards, people were already turning grapes into wine. Why did humans keep drinking it? This is where the story becomes more complicated. Alcohol produces noticeable effects on the brain. People may experience relaxation, reduced inhibitions, changes in mood, and impaired judgment. Ancient humans obviously didn't understand neuroscience, but they could observe the effects. They could see that fermented drinks changed how people behaved. That made alcohol socially significant. People could drink during celebrations, feasts, rituals, community gatherings, and religious ceremonies. Alcohol wasn't simply chemistry anymore. It became part of culture. Alcohol also had risks. But ancient people eventually discovered something else. Alcohol could be dangerous. Too much could cause illness. Poorly made drinks could become contaminated. And intoxication could lead to accidents and conflict. So humans also developed rules around drinking. Some cultures restricted who could drink, when people could drink, how much they could drink, and which drinks were appropriate for religious or social occasions. These rules show that people recognized alcohol's power long before modern science explained why it affected the brain. The mystery of fermentation. For most of human history, fermentation remained mysterious. People could make alcohol, but they didn't know exactly why it happened. They didn't know that microorganisms were responsible. They simply knew if you leave certain ingredients under the right conditions, something happens. Thousands of years later, scientists finally began uncovering the explanation. Microscopes revealed microorganisms. Scientists studied yeast. And eventually, fermentation became a subject of chemistry and biology. What ancient people had learned through experience, modern science could finally explain. From ancient brewers to modern industry, the basic process continued evolving. Ancient brewers used clay vessels. Later civilizations developed better containers. New techniques appeared. Different grains and fruits were experimented with. Distillation eventually allowed humans to produce much stronger alcoholic drinks. And eventually, modern chemistry transformed alcohol production completely. Today, scientists can control temperature, yeast strains, sugar levels, fermentation time, and countless other variables. The ancient brewer had almost none of these tools, yet the fundamental discovery remained the same. Yeast transformed sugar into alcohol. So, how did humans discover alcohol? The truth is, we probably don't have one answer. There was no single inventor, no exact date, no prehistoric scientist standing beside the first fermented drink. Instead, alcohol was probably discovered through a combination of nature, accident, curiosity, observation, and experimentation. A piece of fruit fermented naturally. Someone tasted it. Someone remembered. Someone repeated the process. Another person improved it. And another generation learned from them. Over thousands of years, a natural chemical process became one of humanity's most widespread traditions. So, how did humans discover alcohol? Probably not through a single brilliant invention. Nature made fermentation first. Humans simply learned how to recognize it, control it, and eventually reproduce it. From fermented fruit, to ancient beer, to early wine, to the sophisticated drinks produced today, the story began with something incredibly simple: sugar, yeast, time, and human curiosity. The next time you see an ancient clay pot in a museum, remember, it may not have been just a container. It could have been part of an experiment thousands of years old. An experiment our ancestors performed without knowing anything about microbes, chemistry, or fermentation. They didn't understand the science, but they understood something just as powerful. If you observe nature carefully enough, it can teach you how to transform the world. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of the story. Humans didn't create fermentation. They discovered what nature had already been doing, and then they learned how to make it happen on purpose. From one accidental discovery, an entire tradition was born, and it would eventually become part of agriculture, trade, religion, celebration, and civilization itself. Nature started the process. Humans turned it into history. If you enjoyed discovering this forgotten chapter of human history, subscribe to Tales of Sapiens, because every ordinary thing we know today has an extraordinary story hidden in the past, and we'll uncover it, one story at a time.